Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. We are currently finishing up chapter 10 of The Faith of the Fathers. We got a couple pages left, so this might be a shorter episode. For 50 years, Negro religion thus transformed itself and identified itself with the dream of abolition until that which was a radical fad in the white North and an anarchistic plot in the white South had become a religion to the black world. Thus, when emancipation finally came, it seemed to the freedman a literal coming of the Lord. His fervid imagination was stirred as never before by the tramp of armies, the blood and dust of battle, and the wail and whirl of social upheaval. He stood dumb and motionless before the whirlwind. What had he to do with it? Was it not the Lord's doing and marvelous in his eyes? Joyed and bewildered with what came, he stood awaiting new wonders till the inevitable age of reaction swept over the nation and brought the crisis of today. It is difficult to explain clearly the present critical stage of Negro religion. First, we must remember that living as the blacks do in close contact with the great modern nation and sharing, although imperfectly, the soul life of that nation, they must necessarily be affected more or less directly by all the religious and ethical forces that are today moving the United States. These questions and movements are, however, overshadowed and dwarfed by the, to them, all-important question of their civil, political, and economic status. They must perpetually discuss the, quote, Negro problem, end quote, must live, move, and have their being in it, and interpret all else in its light or darkness. With this come, too, peculiar problems of their inner life, of the status of women, the maintenance of home, the training of children, the accumulation of wealth, and the prevention of crime. All this must mean a time of intense ethical ferment, of religious heart-searching and intellectual unrest. From the double life every American Negro must live, as a Negro and as an American, as swept on by the current of the 19th century while yet struggling in the eddies of the 15th century, from this must arise a painful self-consciousness, an almost morbid sense of personality, and a moral hesitancy which is fatal to self-confidence. The worlds within and without the veil of color are changing, and changing rapidly, but not at the same rate, not in the same way. And this must produce a peculiar wrenching of the soul, a peculiar sense of doubt and bewilderment. Such a double life, with double thoughts, double duties, and double social classes, must give rise to double worlds and double ideals, and tempt the mind to pretense or to revolt, to hypocrisy or to radicalism. In some such doubtful words and phrases can one perhaps most clearly picture the peculiar ethical paradox that faces the Negro of today and is tinging and changing his religious life. Feeling that his rights and his dearest ideals are being trampled upon, that the public conscience is ever more deaf to his righteous appeal, and that all the reactionary forces of prejudice, greed, and revenge are daily gaining new strength and fresh allies, the Negro faces no enviable dilemma. Conscious of his impotence and pessimistic, he often becomes bitter and vindictive, and his religion, instead of a worship, is a complaint and a curse, a wail rather than a hope, a sneer rather than a faith. On the other hand, another type of mind, shrewder and keener and more torturous too, sees in the very strength of the anti-Negro movements its patent weaknesses, and with Jesuitic casuistry is deterred by no ethical considerations in the endeavor to turn this weakness to the black man's strength. Thus we have two great and hardly reconcilable streams of thought and ethical strivings. The danger of the one lies in anarchy, that of the other in hypocrisy. The one type of Negro stands almost ready to curse God and die, and the other is too often found a traitor to right and a coward before force. The one is wedded to ideals remote, whimsical, perhaps impossible of the realization. The other forgets that life is more than meat and the body more than raiment. But, after all, is not this simply the writhing of the age translated into black, the triumph of the lie which today, with this false culture, faces the hideousness of the anarchist assassin? Today, the two groups of Negroes, the one in the North, the other in the South, represent these divergent ethical tendencies, the first tending toward radicalism, the other toward hypocritical compromise. It is no idle regret with which the white South mourns the loss of the old-time Negro, the frank, honest, simple old servant who stood for the earlier religious age of submission and humility. With all his laziness and lack of many elements of true manhood, he was at least open-hearted, faithful, and sincere. Today he is gone, but who is to blame for his going? Is it not those very persons who mourn for him? Is it not the tendency, born of Reconstruction and reaction, to found a society on lawlessness and deception, to tamper with the moral fiber of a naturally honest and straightforward people until the whites threatened to become ungovernable tyrants and the blacks criminals and hypocrites? Deception is the natural defense of the weak against the strong, and the South used it for many years against its conquerors. Today, it must be prepared to see its black proletariat turn that same two-edged weapon against itself. And how natural this is. The death of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner proved long since to the Negro the present hopelessness of physical defense. Political defense is becoming less and less available, and economic defense is still only partially effective. But there is a patent defense at hand, the defense of deception and flattery, of cajoling and lying. It is the same defense which the Jews of the Middle Age used and which left its stamp on their character for centuries. Today, the young Negro of the South who would succeed cannot be frank and outspoken, honest and self-assertive, but rather he is daily tempted to be silent and wary, politic and sly. He must flatter and be pleasant, endure petty insults with a smile, shut his eyes to wrong. In too many cases, he sees positive personal advantage in deception and lying. His real thoughts, his real aspirations, must be guarded in whispers. He must not criticize, he must not complain. Patience, humility, and adroitness must, in these growing black youth, replace impulse, manliness, and courage. With this sacrifice, there is an economic opening, and perhaps peace and some prosperity. Without this, there is riot, migration, or crime. Nor is this situation peculiar to the southern United States. Is it not rather the only method by which undeveloped races have gained the right to share modern culture? The price of culture is a lie. On the other hand, in the North, the tendency is to emphasize the radicalism of the Negro. Driven from his birthright in the South by a situation at which every fiber of his more outspoken and assertive nature revolts, he finds himself in a land where he can scarcely earn a decent living amid the harsh competition and the color discrimination. At the same time, through schools and periodicals, discussions and lectures, he is intellectually quickened and awakened. The soul, long pent up and dwarfed, suddenly expands in newfound freedom. What wonder that every tendency is to excess. What wonder that every tendency is to excess. Radical complaint, radical remedies, bitter denunciation, or angry silence. Some sink, some rise. The criminal and the sensualist leave the church for the gambling hall and the brothel, and fill the slums of Chicago and Baltimore. The better classes segregate themselves from the group life of both white and black and form an aristocracy, cultured but pessimistic, whose bitter criticism stings while it points out no way of escape. They despise the submission and subserviency of the Southern Negroes, but offer no other means by which a poor and oppressed minority can exist side by side with its masters. Feeling deeply and keenly the tendencies and opportunities of the age in which they live, their souls are bitter at the fate which drops the veil between. And the very fact that this bitterness is natural and justifiable only serves to intensify it and make it more maddening. Between the two extreme types of ethical attitude which I have thus sought to make clear wavers the mass of the millions of Negroes, North and South. And their religious life and activity partake of this social conflict within their ranks. Their churches are differentiating, now into groups of cold, fashionable devotees, in no way distinguishable from similar white groups, save in color of skin. now into large social and business institutions, catering to the desire for information and amusement of their members, warily avoiding unpleasant questions both within and without the black world, and preaching in effect, if not in word, dum vivimus vivimus. While we live, let us live, in Latin. But back of this still broods silently the deep religious feeling of the real Negro heart, the stirring, unguided might of powerful human souls who have lost the guiding star of the past and are seeking in the great night a new religious ideal. Someday the awakening will come when the pent up vigor of 10 million souls shall sweep irresistibly toward the goal, out of the valley of the shadow of death, where all that makes life worth living, liberty, justice, and right, is marked, quote, for white people only, end quote. Okay, and that brings us to the end of that chapter. And I didn't do a reflection because I just wanted to. I knew we only had a few pages left, so I just wanted to go ahead and read through it. When Du Bois speaks about the difference between the Negro in the North and the Negro in the South, I think it's important that we remember that this book was published in 1903. This book was published in 1903, and I think that it'll be about 50 to 55 years later when Martin Luther King Jr. would arrive on the public scene during the Montgomery bus boycott, and it would be about 50 years later when Malcolm X would also arrive on the scene as a spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. And of course, the civil rights movement is not just about any individual leaders or any singular movements or singular organizations, but Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. have been the probably the two most notable figures of that time period. And I think part of the reason is because they embodied the uniqueness of the Black experience depending on where you lived at. And I think that Malcolm X was an embodiment of the Black experience if you lived in the North. And I think that Dr. King was that in the South. And that's one of the things that Du Bois speaks about in here is the differencing or the differentiating of the ideology between the two Black people or the two different regions in the country in which Black people lived, and how the Black people who lived in the North tended to be more radical and tended to be more radical in thought, more radical in action, and more educated. And that was one of the things that uh, that's one of the things that you can sort of see in some of Malcolm X beliefs and and the same thing with sort of the Black Panther Party, even though they were in the West Coast and not in the South, is that the people who were outside of the South, some of the Black people who were outside of the South and not uh, maybe necessarily interacting with the the de jure segregation and the de jure Jim Crow laws, were more radical about not tolerating racism and not tolerating these racist acts that were being pushed forth. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of these people who are in the North and in the West during the 20th century come from families who have migrated there from the South, who had got to a breaking point dealing with the racism and the the lynchings and the sharecropping system. They had got to a breaking point where they migrated and left the only area or the only homes that they had known to go to the North or to go to the Midwest and to go to the West. And so that mindset is already sort of implemented in the generations that they would give birth to, is having a less of a tolerance for some of these actions and for some of these acts, as opposed to the Black people who lived in the South, who were still trying to struggle to, as much as it's important to not let the North off the hook or the West of America off the hook or the Midwest of America off the hook for the type of racist ideologies and policies and procedures that they implemented. It is important to remember that it was a more overt and more demonstrative type of racism that existed in the South. And so the people who were struggling in the South had to struggle in a different manner than the people who struggled in the North did. And I think that that's just, again, something that Du Bois highlights and diagnoses very well in the end of this chapter. And I think that as a whole, this chapter, again, reminds us of the chapter that we read in Sister Citizen, which was entitled God. And that chapter in that book spoke specifically about Black women's relationship with religion and how it directly impacted their political decisions and political actions. And in this book, it is not necessarily taking a unique look at Black women themselves, but it's taking a unique look at Black period in this point of time and how religion was having a direct impact on their politics and on their political ideology and their political beliefs. And again, I think that this chapter gives you a very good understanding of the institution of the church and how impactful it is in Black culture, and how it was something that was used at first to religion was something that was used at first to uh, try to suppress and to try to pacify the enslaved people in the colonies. And as time went on, it was something that Black people would take back as a way of empowerment and as a way of struggle. And that has been a constant in the history of Black people and the descendants of the enslaved people in this country, is taking things that had once been used to suppress, or once been used to oppress, or once been used to marginalize or subjugate or pacify, or any other negative used for any other negative uh, effect. And Black people and the descendants of enslaved people have turned those things around and used them for an empowering effect. And I think empowerment is something that is positive, but I think that is a connotation that comes with empowerment that's positive. I don't think that it's necessarily that them taking the religion. I don't think they necessarily took the religion that was being used to have negative impacts on them, and then they used it to have positive impacts. I think that they took it and they used it to empower themselves, and then that empowering uh, did have a positive residual effect. And so the same way that religion was used to keep a certain generation of Black people, or a certain subset of Black people, uh, not wanting to break free out of enslavement, Nat Turner and other people would use that same religion as a reason to break through enslavement. And other people would use religion as a way to point to the fact that Black people and enslaved people were less than human, or that they should be that they were supposed to be in enslavement. Eventually, that same religion, or that same ideology, Black people and enslaved people would use uh, to say that they did not belong in slavery, and that these things were not correct, and that these things were wrong. And so that some of the very first movements of and we've seen that here about abolition as well. Some of the very first movements of abolitionism, some of the very first movements of emancipation have direct ties to religion and the relationship that enslaved people had with religion. And I'm trying to look at this. I'm trying to look at this next chapter, see how many pages it is, see if we should try to. No, we're gonna end this episode here. It'll be a shorter episode, but we'll just keep these chapters broken up, separated. We'll come back tomorrow, and tomorrow will probably be another short episode as well, as we read the next chapter of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And this chapter is entitled Of the Passing of the Firstborn. It's chapter 11. All right, share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I'll let you tomorrow.